Hi everyone, my name is Agnes, and today I'm coming to you with a list of my favorite reads of 2017. These are in no particular order, except for maybe the top three, but I've got quite a lot of books to talk about, so let's just get started. The first book on my list is The Seventh Function of Language by Laurent Binet, and this was translated from the French by Sam Taylor. And this is essentially a political thriller and a satire about the French postmodernists in the 1980s. And it all starts with a traffic accident when famous French literary theorist Roland Barthes was hit by a laundry van on a street in Paris and dies of his injuries soon afterwards. So the author reimagines this historical event by asking the question, what if this wasn't an accident and Barthes was actually assassinated because he had in his possession the instructions of the potentially dangerous seventh function of language. This book is very different in tone from the author's previous novel that was translated into English called HHHH, which is really good as well. It's actually funny because in that book he discusses the genre of historical fiction and questions to what extent it is appropriate for an author who is writing a novel based on historical events to take liberties with the historical facts. And it seems that in writing this book, that concern went straight out the window, because here he weaves this very lighthearted international conspiracy involving academics, politicians, and criminals. Also a very interesting secret international society that organizes these very strange debate duels with ridiculously high stakes. This book includes a lot of discussions on linguistics and semiotics, although I don't think you need to know a lot about these subjects to enjoy this book. But I think that knowing something about the relationship between the French postmodernists and analytical philosophers, also recognizing some of the more famous names, makes it more enjoyable. It's really funny to see the conflict and rivalry, almost high schoolish antics between these two groups of highly intellectual people. And overall, it was a very entertaining read, and I highly recommend it. The second book on my list is Call Me By Your Name by André Aciman, and this is a beautifully written introspective novel about the relationship that develops between 17-year-old Elio and Oliver, a summer guest at his family's Italian villa, who has come from America to assist Elio's father in his research. The book has a very lush and luxurious setting of northern Italy in the 1980s, and the family's summer rituals are evoked so vividly that I could almost feel the sun on my skin while I was reading it. It's a very nuanced exploration of lust, longing, doubt, and disappointment, and this overwhelming infatuation between these two people. And it is written in such precise and beautiful prose that I was completely engrossed in the novel. I also saw the movie adaptation directed by Luca Guadagnino and beautifully shot on 35mm film. And to be honest, given that the book was written from Elio's perspective, I was kind of worried going in that the film will resort to those dreaded voiceover sequences, but fortunately that didn't happen, and the director managed to evoke the lush atmosphere that is so integral to the story. It felt like the characters inhabited a private oasis separated from the actual world where time flows differently. And I think that the long, lingering shots that were used added to that atmosphere. It almost felt like we were, as the audience, witnessing the blossoming of this relationship. Also, I think the casting was excellent. Timothée Chalamet gave a very strong performance as Elio, and he really managed to convey that intelligence and kind of cool confidence combined with self-consciousness and immaturity. And Armie Hammer was very good as Oliver as well. He managed to maintain that balance between his kind of confident movie star demeanor, and at the same time inner vulnerability. Also, his dorky dancing was super adorable. I think the film does rely heavily on its music score, which was intricately designed and beautifully sets the scene from the title sequence up until that very powerful and heartbreaking final shot. So I recommend both versions, and also if you're planning to read the book, you may want to consider getting the audiobook because it's read by Armie Hammer, and having him narrate the story makes it even better. The next book on my list is Compass by Matthias Senard, and this was translated from the French by Charlotte Mandel. And I read this book when it was nominated for last year's Man Booker International Prize, so I'll leave a link to my full review down below if you want to hear more of my thoughts. But this is a very dense and erudite novel. I wouldn't say it was an enjoyable reading experience. It's quite hard to get through, but it has really stayed with me. Compass takes place during one night and follows an insomniac musicologist who reflects on his life, and in doing so also explores the relationship between the Middle East and the West throughout history, and also the concept of otherness. It looks at the various artists, musicians, writers, and academics that have been fascinated and influenced by the Middle East, and it also discusses how the West and the East have always been closely connected and influence each other throughout centuries. It's a beautifully written book, although it does bring to mind the writing style of Marcel Proust. And it's a fascinating read that I think is well worth the effort that it takes to get through it. In contrast to Compass, this next book was one of my most enjoyable reading experiences of the year, and it was hard to put down. And it was Madness is Better Than Defeat by Ned Bowman. And this is a very bizarre and unusual book that is very hard to summarize, but it's basically about these two rival expeditions that in the 1940s that get sent into the Honduras jungle to a recently discovered Mayan temple. And both of these groups have vastly different objectives. So these two rival expeditions arrive at the temple pretty much at the same time, which leads to a very long stalemate between the two teams because neither of the team leaders are willing to back down. So they end up forming two communities that struggle to survive in the jungle. They stay there more than 20 years, after which a CIA agent is sent to locate them. During the course of the novel, we gradually learn more about the connections between the people in both teams and the secrets that lie within the temple. It's a very fun book full of smart and snarky humor, and I usually try to stay away from humorous books because they rarely work for me, but I really like the humor in this one. There's a scene where one of the teams has this large tub where they collect urine. I won't tell you why, but the leader suddenly realizes and panics that it's unguarded, so he says that maybe they should assign people to guard it. And the other guy in response just turns and gives him this silent, puzzled look like, what? So this is a very strange and crazy book, and there's so much going on in it. But if it sounds interesting to you, I recommend checking it out. So these next three books I consider to be my top reads of the year, and the first one is The Little Red Chairs by Edna O'Brien. This is a beautifully written novel that tackles several very heavy subjects in a very precise and powerful way. It looks at the long-lasting effects of war, in this case the Balkan Wars. The book follows an Irish woman who gets into a relationship with a mysterious self-proclaimed healer that comes to this small Irish village, but her life is shattered when the man's past is revealed. So the book explores the themes of guilt and complicity and the image that we create of other people in our mind. It also looks at war refugees and violence against women and the nature of evil. Fair warning, this book contains some of the most horrific torture scenes I've ever read, but at the same time it's a stunning book, and I think you should read it. And at number 2, I have a book that I just randomly picked up from a staff recommendations table while browsing in a bookshop. And it's a sci-fi classic called Ice by Anna Kavan. And this was originally published in 1967 and was just recently reissued in this Penguin Modern Classics edition. And this is a very unusual, gorgeously written novel set in a apocalyptic world that is engulfed in ice and follows an unnamed narrator who is searching for this very strange and enigmatic young woman that he is obsessed with and wants to possess. So the novel plays out as this very strange and unsettling love triangle between the narrator and the woman's tyrannical husband. But it's also about much more than that. It's a very atmospheric book that follows this kind of dream logic, masterfully slipping between reality and fantasy. It's a surreal and disorienting experience, but it's also a very stunning and beautifully written book. So if you don't mind these kind of narratives where you don't get all the answers, I highly recommend it. I was really impressed by this. And finally, and I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone who has followed this channel, my top read of last year was Zeroville by Steve Erickson. I read it at the beginning of last year and I'm still thinking about it. I'll leave a link to my full review down below. But this might have just been the perfect book for me because it combines many of the topics that I'm interested in. It follows a young man who is obsessed with movies and in fact has encyclopedic knowledge of movie history. And he comes to LA in 1969 to be surrounded by like-minded people, but instead he soon realizes that Hollywood is very different from what he imagined. So the book looks at the changes that were happening in the movie industry in the 1970s and also the beginnings of the punk rock movement in LA. It's full of energy and references to actors, directors, and movies from that time period that are an integral part to the themes that are discussed in the novel. The novel is also written in this interesting way where it's divided into hundreds of small chapters that mimic the way a movie is edited. I thought that was very creative and clever. And overall, this is a wild and surreal love letter to movies, and I absolutely loved it. And I look forward to reading more Erickson this year. So those are my top reads of last year. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you read any of these books. I would love to talk to you in the comments. And thank you for watching.